This time, we didn't know what had happened to him. So of course, the thought in the backs of our minds was always that we should be here for him.
October 2025. A federal judge just made a decision that could free the man convicted of America's most famous child murder. For 46 years, the face of 6-year-old Etan Patz has haunted this nation. His disappearance on May 25, 1979, changed everything. How we protect our children, how we investigate missing persons, and how America talks about child safety. In 2017, Pedro Hernandez was sentenced to 25 years to life for strangling this little boy. But now, that conviction has been overturned, and by June 2026, Hernandez could walk free. The detectives who worked this case for 33 years are devastated. The family is shattered. And the question everyone's asking is, did we convict the wrong man? This is the story of how one child's disappearance changed America forever, and why justice might still be out of reach. My dear friend, before we jump into this tragic story, I ask you to take several important actions. Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story. Every single share reaches more people who might recognize these warning signs and save a child. In the comments, write your city and viewing time. This helps me understand when it's best to publish similar investigations so they reach the maximum number of people and can save children's lives. My channel works hard to bring you stories about children who needed protection but didn't get it. Each investigation is not just a story about tragedy. It's a lesson in recognizing dangerous situations. Be sure to watch other videos on the channel, because knowing about cases like these could one day help you notice warning signs and protect a child who's in danger. Thank you for your support. Now, let's begin. May 25th, 1979, the day that changed everything. His name was Etan Patz. He was just 6 years old. Blonde hair, blue eyes, a smile that could light up a room. That Friday morning started like any other, except for one thing. For the first time ever, Etan's parents were letting him walk to the school bus stop, alone. It was only 2 blocks. 2 blocks from their apartment on Prince Street in Soho, Manhattan. At 8 a.m., his mother Julie watched from the fire escape as her little boy walked down the street. She watched until he turned the corner. He never made it to the bus stop. Etan was wearing his favorite blue captain's hat. He had $1 in his pocket, money for a soda after school. Multiple witnesses saw him on Prince Street that morning, and then he vanished. When Etan didn't come home that afternoon, his parents knew something was wrong. They called the police immediately. What happened next was unprecedented. The NYPD launched one of the largest missing child searches in New York City history. Within hours, over 100 officers were deployed. Bloodhounds, helicopters, search teams combing every inch of Soho. They searched every basement, every rooftop, every abandoned building. They drained basements. They tore up concrete. They were desperate to find this little boy. But they found nothing. No clothing, no body, not a single trace. Now, you might be thinking, children go missing. It's tragic, but it happens. So why did this case become so different? Because Etan Patz became the first missing child to receive national media attention. His face was everywhere. In 1984, he became the first child's photo ever printed on a milk carton. President Reagan was so moved by this case that he declared May 25th, the day Etan disappeared, as National Missing Children's Day. This case completely changed how America handles missing children. It created the foundation for what would become the Amber Alert system. It changed parenting culture overnight. After Etan, parents could no longer let their children walk alone without judgment. The innocence of childhood was gone. But no one suffered more than the Patz family. Stan and Julie Patz never moved from their Prince Street apartment. They kept Etan's room exactly as he left it. For decades, His toys, his clothes, his bed, everything frozen in time. Julie blamed herself. She replayed that morning over and over in her mind. If only she had walked with him. If only she had said no. If only she had watched him for just one more second. Stan threw himself into advocacy work. He became a voice for missing children across the country. But the grief, the unbearable, crushing grief, it strained their marriage to the breaking point. Every lead brought hope. Every tip brought a surge of adrenaline. Every suspect brought the possibility of answers. And every dead end brought devastation. For 33 years, the Patz family lived in this nightmare, not knowing, never having closure, unable to move forward, unable to let go. But in 2012, everything changed. For 33 years, investigators chased every lead, every whisper, every possibility. And for most of those years, they were convinced they knew exactly who killed Etan Patz. His name was Jose Ramos. Ramos was a convicted child molester, and he had direct connections to the Patz family. He was dating a woman who used to walk Etan to the school bus stop. He knew Etan. He knew his routine. He had access. And here's where it gets chilling. Ramos admitted to being with a child matching Etan's description in 1979. He said the child was alive when he left him. But when pressed for more details, Ramos refused to say another word. He invoked his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. Ramos was eventually convicted in Pennsylvania for molesting other children. Detectives working the Patz case were 99% certain he was responsible for Etan's death. In 2004, a civil court actually found him responsible for Etan's death. But here's the problem. No body, no physical evidence, no way to bring criminal charges. Jose Ramos walked free. And the investigators? They were destroyed. Lead detective Stuart Grebois worked this case for over 20 years. 20 years of his life dedicated to finding one little boy. Multiple detectives were assigned over 3 decades, and the emotional toll was devastating. Many required therapy, counseling. They described having nightmares about Etan. They felt personal failure with every single dead end. Some of their marriages fell apart under the stress. This case consumed them. It became an obsession. Even after retirement, detectives continued working leads, unpaid, on their own time, because this case had become their life's mission. They couldn't let go. Just like the Patz family couldn't let go. Then in 2010, something shifted. The NYPD Cold Case Unit decided to reopen the investigation. A fresh team of detectives started reviewing over 30 years of files, thousands of tips, hundreds of suspects, mountains of evidence. They applied advanced forensic technology to old evidence. They brought in FBI profilers. They conducted psychological analysis of every suspect. And slowly, their focus began to shift away from Jose Ramos. Maybe they had been wrong all along. And then in May 2012, everything changed. An anonymous tip came in about a man named Pedro Hernandez. The tip said Hernandez had worked at a bodega on Etan's route back in 1979. His brother-in-law reported that Hernandez had confessed at a family gathering years earlier. He said Hernandez admitted to killing a child in New York. Detectives immediately tracked down Hernandez. They found him living in New Jersey, working at a small factory, living a quiet, unremarkable life. But when they dug into his background, red flags appeared everywhere. Hernandez had a documented history of mental illness. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. He had a low IQ. There were records of multiple psychiatric hospitalizations throughout his life. Still, detectives brought him in for questioning. And what happened next shocked everyone. Pedro Hernandez confessed, not just once, multiple times, on camera. He gave detailed descriptions of what happened that morning in 1979. He said he lured Etan into the basement of the bodega where he worked. He said he strangled him. He said he put Etan's body in a bag and threw it in the trash. After 33 years of dead ends, investigators finally had a confession. The Patz family finally had answers. The detectives who had dedicated their lives to this case finally had closure. The media exploded with the news. America's most famous cold case had been solved. But there was a problem. A big problem. Hernandez's confession had inconsistencies. He couldn't remember specific details. His timeline didn't quite match up. And remember, he had severe mental illness, a history of hallucinations, a documented pattern of confusing reality with imagination. Defense attorneys immediately raised questions. Was this a real confession? Or was this a false confession from a mentally ill man who had been manipulated by decades of media coverage? Prosecutors didn't care. They had their confession. They had their suspect. And after 33 years, they were determined to get justice for Etan Patz. Pedro Hernandez was arrested and charged with murder. The case that had haunted America for over 3 decades was finally going to trial. The investigators who had sacrificed everything could finally rest. The Patz family could finally have their day in court. Or so everyone thought. Because what came next would turn this case upside down all over again. May 23, 2012. Detectives sat down with Pedro Hernandez for questioning. Within hours, he confessed to killing Etan Patz. He said he lured Etan into the basement of the bodega where he worked. He promised the boy a soda. He said he choked him, put his body in a box, and threw that box in the trash about a block away. The confession was videotaped. Over 7 hours of footage, and watching it, Hernandez appeared calm, matter-of-fact, almost detached. He provided specific details about that day in 1979, but he also got key facts wrong. And that's where this case gets complicated, because there were red flags everywhere. Massive red flags that should have made investigators pause. Pedro Hernandez had an IQ of 70. That's borderline intellectual disability. He had a documented history of hallucinations and delusions. He was taking antipsychotic medication. And here's the thing. This wasn't his first confession. Hernandez had made false confessions to family members before, multiple times. He had a pattern of confessing to things he didn't do. And when you look at the details of his confession, things don't add up. He got Etan's clothing wrong. The timeline he gave didn't match witness statements. And most importantly, there was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime. None. The body was never found, despite extensive searches of that exact area. And the trash from 1979? Long gone. Impossible to verify his story. So how did this confession even happen? Let's talk about the interrogation. 7 hours. 7 hours of questioning without a lawyer present. Detectives used what's called the Reed technique. It's a controversial interrogation method that's been criticized for producing false confessions. They used minimization. It was an accident, wasn't it? Making it seem less serious. Giving him an out. A way to confess without feeling like a monster. They used maximization. We have evidence. Witnesses saw you. Creating pressure, making him believe they already knew everything. And here's what's crucial. Hernandez never asked for a lawyer. Not once. He appeared suggestible, eager to please, willing to tell detectives what they wanted to hear. Defense experts who later reviewed the interrogation called it a textbook example of a coerced confession. They said Hernandez was manipulated, that his mental illness made him vulnerable, that he couldn't distinguish between reality and the narrative detectives were feeding him. But the prosecution argued the confession was completely voluntary. They said Hernandez was coherent, that he understood his rights, that he chose to confess. So why did detectives believe him? because Hernandez knew details that hadn't been publicly released. He worked at the exact location on Etan's route. He had opportunity. He had access. And parts of his confession matched known facts about the case. But there's something else. Something we need to talk about. In 2015, Pedro Hernandez went to trial. Despite his confession, he pleaded not guilty. The defense argued this was a textbook false confession. They said Hernandez's mental illness made him vulnerable to manipulation, that detectives had fed him details, that he couldn't distinguish between reality and suggestion. The prosecution presented the 7-hour confession video. They brought in expert witnesses who said the confession was valid. Too many accurate details to be false. Too specific to be made up. Expert witnesses battled back and forth. Defense experts explained classic false confession patterns. Prosecution experts insisted this was real. The jury deliberated for 18 days. 18 days of debate, of reviewing evidence, of watching that confession video over and over. And then, one holdout juror refused to convict. Just one. Out of 12. Mistrial declared. The Patz family was devastated. Again. After 36 years of waiting, they still didn't have justice. They still didn't have closure. But prosecutors weren't giving up. In 2017, they retried the case. New jury, same evidence, same confession video. The defense emphasized Hernandez's mental health issues even more aggressively this time. Psychiatric experts testified about his schizophrenia, about his history of hallucinations, about his pattern of false confessions. False confession experts explained coercion tactics in detail. They walked the jury through every manipulation technique used during that interrogation. But the prosecution stayed focused. They hammered on specific details that only the killer would know. Details that couldn't have been fed to Hernandez. Details that proved he was there. The jury deliberated for 9 days, and on February 14, 2017, they reached a verdict. Guilty. Guilty of second-degree murder. After 38 years, the Patz family finally had their conviction. Finally had someone held accountable for Etan's death. In April 2017, Hernandez was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Etan Patz addressed the court. He described decades of unbearable pain, of not knowing, of hoping, of grieving without closure. His voice broke as he spoke about his son, about the little boy who never came home. The judge acknowledged Hernandez's mental health issues, but he upheld the conviction. Justice, he said, had finally been served, but Hernandez maintained his innocence, despite his confession, despite the conviction. He said he didn't kill Etan Patz. The defense immediately filed an appeal. They argued the confession was coerced, unreliable. They questioned whether justice had truly been served. And here's where things get even more complicated, because many people still believe Jose Ramos was the real killer. Remember Ramos? The convicted child molester who knew Etan, who had access to him, who admitted to being with a child matching Etan's description in 1979. A civil court had already found him responsible for Etan's death back in 2004. FBI profilers had identified him as the primary suspect for decades. His connection to the family, his access to Etan, his pattern of child abuse. Everything pointed to Ramos. But Ramos died in prison in 2022. He was never charged with Etan's murder. Many investigators still believe Ramos was the real killer. They argue that police ignored Ramos' evidence to close the case, that they had tunnel vision, that they focused so intensely on Hernandez's confession that they ignored all the alternatives. The defense argued this exact point. They said the obsession with getting closure led to the wrong conviction. And that question haunts this case to this day. Did the desperate need for answers after 33 years lead investigators to accept a false confession? Did they convict an innocent mentally ill man while the real killer walked free? Or was Pedro Hernandez truly guilty? Was his confession real? Did justice finally prevail? For years it seemed like the case was closed. Hernandez was in prison. The Patz family had their conviction. America's most famous cold case had been solved. But then, everything changed again. October 2025. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit reviewed Pedro Hernandez's case. A 3-judge panel examined every piece of evidence, every detail of that confession, every aspect of the interrogation. Between October 14th and 17th, oral arguments were heard in Manhattan. Legal experts from both sides presented their cases. And then, on October 20th, 2025, the court announced a stunning decision. Conviction overturned. In a 2-to-1 ruling, the appeals court declared Hernandez's confession fundamentally unreliable. They ruled that his mental state made the confession inadmissible, that the coercive interrogation tactics violated his due process rights. Legal experts were shocked, not just by the decision, but by the timing and the decisiveness of it. After 8 years in prison, Pedro Hernandez's murder conviction was thrown out. So what was the court's reasoning? They pointed to Hernandez's IQ of 70. That's intellectual disability. They noted his schizophrenia diagnosis, his active hallucinations at the time of his confession. But here's what really mattered to the judges. There was no independent corroboration of his confession. None. Physical evidence? Zero. After 33 years of investigation, after extensive searches, after deploying every resource available, nothing. Etan's body was never found, despite Hernandez giving specific details about where he disposed of it. Trash collection records showed that area was searched extensively back in 1979. Nothing was ever recovered. The timeline had inconsistencies that were never adequately resolved. Witnesses placed Etan elsewhere after the alleged murder time. Details that didn't match up. Details that were ignored because investigators had their confession. The court cited landmark false confession research. They referenced cases like the Central Park Five, like Brendan Dassey. Cases where mentally vulnerable people confessed to crimes they didn't commit. The majority opinion was damning. Quote, "The confession appears to be the product of mental illness rather than guilty knowledge." They went further. Detectives' desperation for closure after 33 years may have clouded judgment. And here's the line that changes everything. Without physical evidence, confession alone cannot sustain a murder conviction. The court also emphasized Hernandez's suggestibility, his documented psychiatric history. They said these factors create reasonable doubt that cannot be ignored. But one judge dissented. He argued that the jury heard all the evidence and convicted, that this was appellate court overreach, that they were second-guessing a jury's decision. Legal scholars are now debating a crucial question. When does mental illness negate confession validity? The immediate fallout was explosive. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office released a statement saying they're reviewing options. That's legal speak for, we don't know what to do. The Patz family issued their own statement. They said they were devastated, betrayed by the justice system. Etan Patz spoke publicly. His words were heartbreaking. "We finally had peace. Now it's ripped away again." Hernandez remains in custody for now, pending the DA's decision. Defense attorneys are celebrating. They're calling this justice finally being served for a mentally ill man who was wrongfully convicted. But victim advocates are outraged. They're saying a technicality is letting a killer walk free. NYPD detectives have refused to comment publicly. But private sources say investigators are gutted, absolutely devastated. So what happens next? The DA has until June 2026 to decide. retry Hernandez, or dismiss the charges entirely. They have three options on the table. Option 1. Retry Hernandez without the confession evidence. But that's nearly impossible. The confession was their entire case. Without it, they have nothing. Option 2. Negotiate a plea deal to a lesser charge. Time served. Hernandez walks free but with some admission of guilt. Option 3. Dismiss the charges entirely. Hernandez walks free, completely exonerated. If the charges are dismissed, this case returns to cold case status. Jose Ramos is dead. He cannot be prosecuted. The statute of limitations doesn't apply to murder, so technically the case stays open. But the realistic chance of solving it now? Virtually zero. Etan's body is still missing. After 46 years, his family still doesn't have closure. They still don't know what happened to their little boy. And now, they may never know. The man convicted of killing their son might walk free. The man many believe was the real killer is dead. And America's most famous cold case is back to square one. 46 years later, the question remains: what happened to Etan Patz? Let's talk about why innocent people confess to crimes they didn't commit. Research shows that 25% of wrongful convictions involve false confessions. 1 in 4. That's not a small number. And intellectually disabled suspects are especially vulnerable. If your IQ is below 75, you're 2 to 3 times more likely to falsely confess. Mental illness compounds that suggestibility. Schizophrenia patients may confuse their delusions with reality. They may not be able to distinguish between what actually happened and what they imagined. Pedro Hernandez had a documented history of making false statements to family members. This wasn't new behavior. This was a pattern. So how does this happen? How do detectives get innocent people to confess? It often comes down to interrogation techniques, specifically something called the Reed technique. The Reed technique is the most common interrogation method used by U.S. law enforcement. It's designed to break down resistance, to elicit a confession. It's a 9-step process that emphasizes psychological manipulation. Step 1. Confrontation. We know you did it. State it as fact, not question. Step 2. Theme development. It was an accident, wasn't it? Give the suspect an out. Make it seem less serious. Step 3. Handling denials. Interrupt them. Don't allow explanations. Keep them off balance. Critics say this technique produces false confessions, that it's particularly dangerous with vulnerable populations like Hernandez. Many countries have actually banned the Reed technique. The UK doesn't use it. Canada doesn't use it. They use investigative interviewing instead, a method focused on gathering information, not securing confessions. But in the United States, it's still standard practice. Now let's look at Hernandez's specific vulnerabilities. His IQ of 70 places him in the bottom 2% of the population. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia as a teenager. He had a history of visual and auditory hallucinations. He told family members he saw visions of murdered children. He made previous false confessions about other crimes. He had an extremely suggestible personality type. He was eager to please authority figures. He had poor memory and confabulation issues. He was on antipsychotic medication, but was still symptomatic. All of these factors made him the perfect candidate for a false confession. But let's also understand the detective's perspective. After 33 years, investigators were desperate for closure. The pressure from the Patz family was immense. The media attention was relentless. The public demanded answers. The Jose Ramos lead had gone cold. Ramos refused to talk. They had nothing. And then Hernandez confessed. It seemed like a miracle breakthrough. The detectives genuinely believed they had their man. They weren't trying to frame an innocent person. They thought they were finally solving the case. But confirmation bias set in. They saw evidence that supported the confession. They ignored or minimized contradictory evidence. This is a psychological phenomenon called tunnel vision. It's not malicious. It's human error under extreme pressure. So what do experts say about this specific case? Dr. Saul Kassin is one of the world's leading false confession experts. He called this a textbook example of a coerced compliant confession. He said Hernandez confessed to end the psychological pressure, that he believed the confession would make the interrogators happy, that he may have actually convinced himself he was guilty through the questioning process. Defense psychiatric experts testified that Hernandez's schizophrenia made him unable to distinguish reality from delusion, that his confession was a product of mental illness, not guilty knowledge. Prosecution experts argued the confession was too detailed to be fabricated, that only the real killer could have known those specifics. But the scientific community largely sides with the defense interpretation. The research is clear. People with intellectual disabilities and mental illness are extraordinarily vulnerable to false confessions, especially when subjected to hours of psychologically manipulative interrogation techniques. And that's exactly what happened to Pedro Hernandez. Let's talk about something we don't discuss enough: the human cost of cold cases on the investigators themselves. Lead detective Stuart Grabois worked the Etan Patz case for over 20 years. He retired in 2004 without solving it. He described it as his life's greatest failure. Multiple detectives were assigned to this case over 3 decades. Many of them experienced PTSD. They had nightmares about Etan's face. They imagined his final moments over and over. Marriages failed. Relationships were strained. Some required professional counseling and therapy just to cope. Their children grew up hearing about Etan at the dinner table. This case consumed their lives. It defined their careers. Why did this case hit different? Etan was the same age as many of these detectives' own children. This was the first major missing child case with national attention. The pressure was unlike anything investigators had ever experienced. Every lead brought hope. Every dead end brought despair. The Patz family's grief was palpable, a constant reminder of their failure to bring Etan home. The media scrutiny intensified the emotional toll. The public blamed police for not solving the case. Internal pressure from NYPD leadership was relentless. When Hernandez confessed in 2012, detectives felt vindication. Finally, they could give the Patz family closure. Finally, they could solve the case that had haunted them for decades. But some investigators had doubts from the start. The confession didn't match their evidence. There were timeline problems, factual errors. But after 33 years, they wanted to believe. They needed to believe. This is cognitive dissonance. The evidence versus the desire for resolution. Some detectives privately questioned the conviction. Others fully believed Hernandez was guilty. And then came October 2025. The conviction was overturned. The decision devastated the investigative team. Retired detectives who worked this case for decades feel betrayed. We gave our lives to this case, and for what? Current detectives face an impossible situation. There are no new leads, no physical evidence, no viable suspects. Ramos is dead. Hernandez may walk free. This case will likely never be solved, and the detectives must live with that reality. So what are the lessons for law enforcement? There needs to be better training on interrogating vulnerable suspects. All interrogations should be recorded, not just the confessions. We need to recognize the danger of confirmation bias in high-pressure cases. Mental health screening should be mandatory before interrogations. Confessions should be independently reviewed by uninvolved detectives. There should be corroboration requirements for confession-only cases. Investigators working long-term cases need psychological support systems. And law enforcement needs to recognize that closure isn't worth a wrongful conviction. We need to balance solving cases with protecting the innocent. That means exploring alternatives to the Reed technique, using investigative interviewing methods instead, documenting a suspect's mental state throughout questioning. It means mandatory breaks, food, water during extended interrogations. It means clearly explaining legal representation rights to vulnerable suspects. These aren't just procedural changes. These are protections. For suspects, for victims' families, and for the investigators themselves. Because the Etan Patz case shows us what happens when the system fails. Everyone loses. 46 years of grief. Stan and Julie Patz separated in 2001. They divorced after decades of strain. Both eventually remarried, but Etan's loss defined their entire lives. They never moved from the Prince Street apartment where Etan lived. They kept his room preserved for decades as a shrine. Every birthday, every holiday, marked by his absence. Etan would be 52 years old today if he were alive. The family imagined what he'd look like, who he'd become, what kind of man he would have been. His siblings grew up in the shadow of their missing brother. Ari Patz, Etan's younger brother, became a psychologist specializing in trauma. The case shaped every aspect of their lives. The family became advocates for missing children nationwide. They turned their pain into purpose. And then, in 2017, after 38 years, came the guilty verdict. Finally, closure. Stan Patz gave a victim impact statement. He said, "We can finally grieve." They could visit Etan's memorial without wondering if his killer was walking free. They began the process of emotional healing after nearly 4 decades. They started dismantling Etan's preserved room. They allowed themselves to move forward with their lives. Justice for Etan had finally been achieved, or so they thought. They did media appearances celebrating the conviction. Their advocacy work continued with renewed purpose. They had peace. And then came October 2025. The conviction was overturned. The family released a statement. "Our nightmare has returned." Stan Patz asked, "How many times must we relive our son's murder?" They're angry at the justice system for failing Etan again. They're frustrated that mental illness could negate a confession. They keep asking, if Hernandez didn't kill Etan, why did he confess? The family believes Hernandez is guilty despite the court ruling. They believe they finally had the right man. And now he might walk free. The healing process they'd started has been shattered by this appellate decision. Now they must wait until June 2026 for the DA's decision. The possibility of a retrial means reliving all the testimony again, sitting in that courtroom, hearing the details of their son's murder. Again. Or worse, Hernandez walks free. The case is never solved. They never get answers. Julie Patz is now in her 70s. She may never see justice for her son. Stan Patz continues his advocacy work, but he admits feeling defeated, exhausted, broken. And now the family faces an impossible choice. They want justice, but they fear another trial. A retrial without the confession evidence will likely fail. It could result in an acquittal, and double jeopardy would prevent any future prosecution. But dismissing the charges means admitting they convicted the wrong man, that Hernandez was innocent, that they still don't know what happened to Etan. The family is trapped between bad options. No good outcomes, only varying degrees of pain. The legacy of Etan's case now includes a wrongful conviction debate. The changes to missing children protocols remain his positive legacy. Amber alerts, missing children on milk cartons, national databases. but his actual killer may never be held accountable. And the Patz family must live with that reality for the rest of their lives. 46 years of grief and counting. The American justice system heavily relies on confessions. 80% of criminal cases involve confession evidence, but research shows confessions aren't always reliable. The Innocence Project found that 29% of DNA exonerations involved false confessions. Nearly 1 in 3. Courts struggle to balance the value of confessions against reliability concerns. The Etan Patz case highlights this fundamental tension perfectly. Let's talk about mental illness in the criminal justice system. An estimated 20% of jail inmates have serious mental illness. Schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, intellectual disabilities. These suspects are particularly vulnerable to coercive tactics. But mental illness doesn't automatically mean innocence. Courts must determine competency versus culpability. The Hernandez case raises the question, where's the line? Can someone with an IQ of 70 and schizophrenia give a valid confession? Different states have different standards. There are no federal guidelines for interrogating mentally ill suspects. This brings us to the corroboration problem. Should confessions alone be enough to convict? Many states require corroborating evidence. But New York allowed confession-only convictions until recently. The Hernandez case had zero physical evidence. No body, no DNA, no witnesses, no forensics. Only his words during a 7-hour interrogation. The appellate court says that's not enough. But what about cases where a body is never found? What about serial killers who confess without leading police to remains? The justice system must balance victim rights with defendant protections. It's not an easy balance. So what precedent does this case set? The Second Circuit ruling could affect hundreds of cases. Confessions from intellectually disabled suspects will now be scrutinized more carefully. Prosecutors must provide independent corroboration. Defense attorneys will cite the Etan Patz case for years to come. This may lead to overturned convictions nationwide. But it also may let guilty people walk free. The pendulum swings between protecting the innocent and convicting the guilty. There's no perfect solution. So what needs to change? Mandatory recording of entire interrogation processes, not just the confessions. Mental health evaluations before questioning vulnerable suspects. Independent confession review boards. Corroboration requirements in all confession cases. Better training for law enforcement on false confessions. Psychological research integrated into interrogation protocols. Victim families deserve justice, but not at the cost of wrongful conviction. Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg has until June 2026 to decide what happens next. He has 3 realistic options on the table. Option 1. Retry the case without the confession. This is almost impossible to win. Option 2. Negotiate a plea deal for time served. Hernandez walks free. Option 3. Dismiss all charges. The case returns to cold status. Legal experts predict dismissal is the most likely outcome. A retrial without the confession has virtually no chance of conviction. There's no physical evidence after 46 years. All witnesses from 1979 are elderly or deceased. And Hernandez has already served 8 years. The time served argument is strong. So what happens if Hernandez goes free? He'll be 62 years old. He's spent 8 years in prison. He'll likely return to New Jersey and live a low-profile life. Will he maintain his innocence, or will he continue claiming guilt? His mental health treatment will be critical. There are public safety concerns if he's actually guilty, but if he's innocent, he deserves compensation for wrongful imprisonment. He could file a civil lawsuit against the NYPD. He could receive millions in a wrongful conviction settlement. Either way, public outrage would be massive. Can this case ever be solved? The realistic answer is probably not. Jose Ramos died in 2022. He can't be prosecuted. Physical evidence from 1979 is gone. The crime scene has been built over multiple times. Witnesses' memories have faded, or the witnesses are deceased. DNA technology can't help without a body or evidence. This case will likely remain officially unsolved forever. Etan's body may never be recovered. His family will never have a burial, never have final closure. But what about other suspects? Over 33 years, the NYPD investigated over 200 suspects. Several had opportunity and motive. Some had histories of child abuse. But all were cleared, or the evidence was insufficient. Could the real killer still be alive? Possibly, but they're likely elderly or deceased by now. The anonymous tip line remains open. Cold case detectives still review occasional leads. But resources are limited. This case is 46 years old. Realistically, solving it now would require a miracle confession or new evidence. But Etan's legacy extends far beyond the crime itself. National Missing Children's Day, observed every May 25th, honors Etan. He was the first child on a milk carton, sparking nationwide awareness. The Amber Alert system was partially inspired by his case. Missing children protocols were completely transformed. Parenting culture changed. Stranger danger became mainstream. Sex offender registries expanded after his case. His disappearance saved countless other children. Even without justice, his impact is immeasurable. So what does this case teach us? Justice delayed is often justice denied. Cold cases become exponentially harder to solve over time. Pressure to solve high-profile cases can lead to mistakes. Desperation for closure doesn't justify cutting corners. Mental illness complicates every aspect of criminal justice. Confessions aren't the gold standard we once believed. Physical evidence matters more than ever. Families deserve truth, not just convictions. Sometimes there are no good answers, only painful choices. The justice system is imperfect, run by imperfect humans. Balancing victim rights with defendant rights is an impossible equation. We must accept that some cases may never be solved. Closure isn't always achievable, even after decades. And this brings us to the broader true crime conversation. This case forces us to question our assumptions about guilt. The true crime community often demands quick answers. But reality is messy, complicated, frustrating. Not every case has a satisfying resolution. Sometimes the solved case wasn't actually solved. We must hold space for uncertainty and doubt. Advocacy for victims and protection of the accused both matter. Justice isn't always black and white. Our obsession with closure can blind us to truth. Did Pedro Hernandez kill Etan Patz? We may never know for certain. Was his confession real, or the product of mental illness? Experts disagree. Did police tunnel vision cause them to ignore other suspects? Possibly. Was Jose Ramos the real killer? He took that secret to his grave. Will Etan's body ever be found? After 46 years, it's unlikely. Will his family ever have true closure? Probably not. Was justice served in 2017? The appellate court says no. Will justice be served in 2026? That depends on your definition of justice. Here's what we know for sure. A 6-year-old boy walked to a bus stop and never came home. His disappearance changed America forever. His face became the symbol of every missing child. Hundreds of investigators dedicated their lives to finding answers. A family has lived 46 years without their son. The case has been solved, and now unsolved again. By June 2026, we'll know if anyone will be held accountable. But we may never know what really happened on May 25, 1979. This isn't just about Etan Patz anymore. It's about how we define justice in impossible situations. It's about the cost of getting it wrong. It's about the investigators who gave everything. It's about a family that will never stop grieving. It's about a little boy who deserved better. And it's about a justice system trying to balance the scales. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think happened to Etan Patz? Should Hernandez be retried or released? Did the confession seem credible to you? How do we balance mental illness with accountability? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe for updates when the DA makes their decision in June 2026. This story isn't over yet.